Quick question. What is urban planning? Before you answer, I just got this thing. Go ahead, no pressure. What is urban planning? I'll let you off the hook, this time, mostly because this is a video so I can't hear your answer, but also because it's sort of a trick question. There are tons of definitions of urban planning, but they all kind of say the same thing. If we really want to know what urban planning is, then we need to approach the question philosophically. What I'm asking you is this: can you define urban planning without adding any of your own beliefs and values to the definition? This isn't as easy as it seems. You might be asking yourself, why is this important? Well, I'm gonna tell you. That's the point of the video. I'm gonna tell you why it matters, and at the end, you can decide if you agree with me or not. We can agree that urban planning plays a role in shaping the future, but everyone has their own idea of how that ought to happen. What I think urban planning ought to be is different from what a centrist or right-winger thinks it ought to be. But urban planning is what it is, regardless of what anyone thinks it ought to be. Urban planning has limitations that force it into a certain direction. By removing our personal values, we can figure out those limits and the direction that it's taking us. That's what urban planning actually is. I have a channel announcement at the end of this video, so please stick around if you appreciate my work. Until then, let's try to get to the bottom of this. Let's try to remove our personal values and reveal what's going on at the heart of urban planning. If you're here, I assume you're familiar with urban planning. I hope I'm not the first person to tell you about it, or maybe I do, but most likely you're familiar, even if my question doesn't make a lot of sense right now. Urban planning is more popular than ever for some reason. That certainly wasn't the case when I started planning school. I would say that the popularity of city building games like City Skylines and the rise of urbanist YouTube are the primary reasons for its popularity. A lot of people get into urban planning to try and make the places they live better. Learning about urban planning can be really special. It's usually a time of intense optimism and hope for the future. Some people even think that good urban planning is the key to a good life. Some people. If you've seen my content before, then you know that I've been an urban planner for over a decade. I'm also extremely critical of my own profession. I want you to keep your optimism. Without that optimism, there is no hope for the future, but I'm going to challenge you today. The only way to make the world a better place is to understand what's blocking our path forward. Urban planning is usually portrayed as a tool that anyone can use, and the tool of our urban salvation. With the rise of online urbanists, which please don't group me with them, planning has never looked better. Urban planning, who can do no wrong despite a long history of doing only wrong. Urban planning, as it actually exists in our society, is hindering progress. And if we know something is harming us, then maybe we can figure out how to replace it with something that cures us. Part 1, the simulation. In the first planning course I ever took, we had to play SimCity 4 for 6 hours and show the professor our cities. SimCity 4 is, in my opinion, the best city builder. It's very simple, but actually quite challenging. City Skylines is a close second. I've seen city builders described as toys instead of games, and I think that's why they're so relaxing. When I was writing this video, the wheels started turning. Like I said, I think a lot of people find out about urban planning through City Skylines, but can City Skylines tell us anything about what planning actually is? I sat down with City Skylines and a stack of note cards determined to figure this out. I booted up the game, picked a map, and named it Urban Planning County. That's my only tip for you. See, City Skylines wants us to think of each map as a single city, but if we're building several distinct and detached settlements on one map, then the map works more like a county, right? I will die on this hill. If you're not familiar, the game restricts you to a single square of land at first. You have to build a settlement here before you can unlock more of the game. You unlock things in pieces as you increase your population. The game calls these milestones. From the outset, here are the facts. There is latent demand for residential development. What I mean is, there are Sims that want to live here before you even start building. And they'll live literally anywhere you build as long as it's connected to the transportation network. There's nothing that draws them here. There are no jobs, no places to shop, no schools, no fire departments. There's nothing here at all, but the demand to live here is high. Once you have some roads, you can zone along them. Zoning allows the in-game private real estate developers to build based on demand. Once Sims move in, they'll demand commercial real estate. Once your commercial zones develop, then those businesses will demand industrial development. You don't control when the private market builds, but through zoning, transportation, and public service placement, you do control the quality of development. City Skylines tries to simulate the real world. This means it's simulating the capitalist land development process. As I said, you can't directly control the private market. You can only encourage development through transportation and public service investments. These things all come at a cost, which you pay for through taxes. If you're good at the game, the investments you make will increase your overall tax revenue. This allows you to make even more investments. That's the gameplay loop. If you and I started a game at the same time and played until we unlocked the same milestone, our cities would look completely different. Maybe you put parks down on every block, and maybe I consolidated them on the edges of neighborhoods. Maybe you built civic centers where all of the services are clustered, and maybe I put them wherever I had available land. What we each think planning ought to be in this example differs greatly between our save files. But the game doesn't care. Parks and schools both make property values go up. They advance the gameplay loop by increasing our tax revenue. The aesthetics and equity of where we place these services varies, but the game is blind to our aspirations. The game correlates these things with property values, so what planning actually is in City Skylines is a process to increase property values and therefore tax revenue, so that it can be reinvested into the city. There's a gap between how we design our cities and how we keep the game going. In the case of City Skylines, keeping the game going is what planning is, and the player's style of doing so is what planning ought to be. Even though we haven't gone very far yet, let's recap. City Skylines imitates our world, which is a capitalist one. That's how the game is structured. You can't build cities as a socialist, a communist, or even an anarcho-capitalist. You're limited to build a city as a neoliberal capitalist, more or less. To City Skylines, those limitations are what the game thinks urban planning is. These limitations guide all player actions. We can add personal touches that make the appearance of our cities different, and in doing so, we're developing our own personal theories of what planning ought to be. But all these theories of what planning ought to be in the game world and the real one are bound by the limits of what planning actually is. If that doesn't make sense right now, that's okay. Let's move from the game world and into the real one. Part 2, Mind the Gap. Now that you're hooked, we're going to stop talking about video games. It's time to talk about philosophy, and I'm bringing out David Hume, a fellow fat guy who got a lot of hateful comments about his content. Now, I've only read some of Hume's treatise of human nature, and while that does mean I'm better than you, it also means I'm not an expert. What I know is that David Hume argued that there's a gap between what we think something ought to be and what it actually is. Simply put, the gap represents our own personal values and sometimes flawed logic. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher. His main deal, as I understand it, is that we can't acquire knowledge through reason alone. We can only know things we directly observe and experience. I've linked a video by the YouTubers Sound and Sophia, who I think does a really good job explaining the is-ought gap. I'll be using what I learned from that video here. Let's make two statements and a conclusion. First, let's say rent control prohibits rent hikes. And second, my building has rent control. If those statements are both true, then we can correctly deduce that rent hikes are prohibited in my building. The conclusion is specifically derived from the statement, so it's logically sound. There is no is-ought gap here. But let's say I have statement 1, cyclist deaths are increasing, and statement 2, protected bike lanes save cyclist lives. Can we logically conclude that cities ought to build more protected bike lanes? No, we can't. That conclusion is unrelated to the facts of the first two statements. It's a value statement. And for the record, it's my value statement. I think cities should build more bicycle infrastructure, but that belief falls in the is-ought gap. We could add a third statement to fill in the gap. That statement would be something like, cyclist lives ought to be saved. Now it's logically valid, but that added statement is subjective. These are my values, and unfortunately, there are a lot of people who don't share those values. This logic problem helps us see the is-ought gap, but it's just an illustration. In real life, we're not able to figure out someone's value system by breaking it down like this. And sometimes the is-ought gap is present even when everything appears to be objectively true. This is the case for most mainstream definitions of urban planning. Think back to City Skylines. Remember that I said our style of gameplay reflects our theory of what we think planning ought to be. If we play the game using only our ought theory, our cities will probably go bankrupt. We have to adapt our own styles to how the game actually works, the game's theory of what planning is. The distance between what we want to do in the game and what we have to do in the game, that's an is-ought gap. And so, the distance between what people think urban planning should do and what it actually does, that's also an is-ought gap. Let's look into that now. Part 3, Mainstream Planning Theory. If I may remove my Humean sleeping bonnet, we can look at some urban planning definitions. Truthful moment, I didn't think this David Hume thing up. I was inspired to make this video by one of my favorite explorations of radical planning. If you didn't already know, radical planning is a concept that extends far beyond this channel. I stole the name for search engine optimization. A.J. Scott and S.T. Roes published a substantial contribution to the field in 1977 with their paper Urban Planning in Theory and Practice, a Reappraisal. Scott and Roes argue that mainstream planning theory can only describe what planning ought to be. These theories are usually built on a priori concepts, which is Latin for from the earlier. They usually appear as definitional knowledge. The most common example of an a priori statement is all bachelors are unmarried. We don't have to ask every bachelor if they're married or not, since that's the definition. Although I think David Hume would disagree with that. In terms of theory building, a priori conclusions are boring. They don't reveal much about things. As Scott and Roes argue, a good theory should make us want to dig deeper into the subject. Urban planning theory shouldn't be based solely on a review of past actions or simple linguistic definitions. But this is what mainstream planning theory is. It describes planning as an abstract analytical concept, not something tethered to the society that created it. So with that in mind, I want to explore mainstream planning. What are common definitions of urban planning, and are they actually theories of what planning ought to be? I'm going to take you through some contemporary examples of this. With each example, I'm going to ask a rhetorical question. The point of this question is to show how these definitions are missing something. Do not answer my rhetorical questions in the comments. Maybe look up the definition of rhetorical if you feel so compelled. Let's start simple. I don't think that r/urban planning is a friend to the channel, and judging from a lot of the posts on there, I'm cool with that. They have a silly definition of urban planning, and it's the briefest one I could find. It reads, "Urban planning aims to improve the built, natural, social, cultural, and economic aspects of cities and towns." This is a theory of what planning ought to be, comprised entirely of an a priori statement. It doesn't reveal anything or inspire further investigation. But to some people, the simplicity of the statement makes it seem objective. Here's my rhetorical question. Who decides what an improvement is? Do not answer that. It's not meant to be answered, it's rhetorical. Once you graduate from the school of Reddit, you may move on to Planetizen, which is whatever. Planetizen's page on the definition of urban planning is pretty long, but the definition reads as follows. Planners participate in the whole process of defining a vision for the future, from gathering public feedback to synthesizing that information into an actionable legal document, for example, a comprehensive plan, to developing and monitoring the implementation tools, for example, zoning codes, necessary to achieve the vision established by the plan. A broad definition of the term urban planning, therefore, can be as simple as deciding on an urban vision for the future of a community. This doesn't explain anything. Later on the page, they admit that they wanted to create a vague definition. They want to be friends with everybody. But my question is, who has the final say in defining an urban vision? Don't answer that. I saved the worst for last. The American Planning Association is the guiding institution for my profession. They are the tastemakers of what mainstream urban planning is. They're firmly neoliberal, and they seem to move further and further right each year. Their definition of urban planning is written like an advertising pitch, so that's how I'll read it. Planning is elected leaders' most effective tool for managing growth, navigating change, and making tough decisions facing communities, like where to invest in transportation, housing, and parks. Powered by community planners' data-driven insights, expertise, and sense of residents' needs, the planning process helps communities define their goals and a path to achieving them. A plan is a roadmap that helps leaders make informed decisions about what residents and the local economy need to thrive. I think it's funny that they portray planning as like something that people don't know about or isn't like legally required. This definition is as boring as the others. My rhetorical question pulls from this definition and the APA's series called It Takes a Planner to Increase Housing Supply. All of their recommendations are deregulatory. Now, I don't want to argue about how much deregulation will help us out of the housing crisis. You can watch my other videos for that. But deregulation does mean that urban planners are less involved in how cities develop. So my question is, if improving a city requires urban planners, then why would most of the APA's recommendations diminish the role of urban planners in cities? All of these definitions are brief, so I looked at something longer from the mainstream. In 2020, the Oxford University Press published City Planning by Carl Abbott as part of their very short introduction series. The way I found out about this book was from Twitter user J. Blaine Foster, who brilliantly juxtaposed these very short introductions with pride flags. They posted the ethics/bisexual combo right before the city planning/men-loving men combo, which is literally me. These are my flags. What came after city planning? Oh, God. I don't know how many people read this particular introduction of urban planning, but I think it's representative of mainstream theory in general. And what I mean to say is its assumptions are boring. First, Abbott defines urban planning as efforts to shape the physical form and distribution of activities within cities and regions. The objects of planning are sites and systems, the neighborhoods and places within which we carry on our lives and the networks that link the parts of a metropolitan area into a dynamic whole. He then breaks planning down into three groups: professionals, citizens, and the real estate development industry. Of professionals, he says that they guide both public and private actors. Of citizens, he says they engage collectively or individually, mostly in reaction to planning decisions. Of developers, he says they act as de facto city planners, filling in the planning sketch with places to live and work. These practical planners see attractive land, envision it covered with buildings, and try to turn their vision into a reality within existing regulations. They put houses on vacant lots, subdivisions and industrial parks on farmland, office towers on the sites of low-rise buildings. They work within the competitive real estate market, but the city they create is unified by common assumptions. In each nation and generation, city builders have created everyday neighborhoods and business districts that reflect the prevailing tastes and market forces. This is an ideological statement. Now, I make ideological statements all the time, but I also let people know my political beliefs. Abbott is trying to write from a neutral point of view, but it doesn't work that way. We can see his own is-ought gap from these sorts of statements. His definition suggests that urban planners, when working with politicians and the public, have total control over development. He also argues that developers fully conform to the planner's vision. He strips away the developers' autonomy, their influence, and their power. After reading the entire book, it's clear that Abbott does not believe that the economy has a significant impact on how planning is carried out. And if not exactly that, then he at least doesn't believe we need to address the economy when discussing planning. I came to this conclusion partly through his use of Henri Lefebvre. If you watched my third place video, then you know that Lefebvre is an inspiration of mine. I've only read a little of the Critique of Everyday Life, and while that does mean I'm better than you, it also means I'm not an expert. Still, I think I have a better grasp on Lefebvre than Abbott does. Lefebvre was first and foremost a Marxist. He was applying Marxism to urban planning. While Lefebvre did believe in the importance of cities, especially revolutionary importance, Abbott takes his message and twists it to fit a liberal context. He writes, "The tension between master plans and practice illustrates the theoretical argument of French sociologist Henri Lefebvre that urban space is always the product of abstract plans and general regulations, the practical ways in which people conduct their daily lives, and the meanings with which they imbue the places and spaces where they live and work. It is the residents who animate plans and bring cities to life." This completely misses the point of Lefebvre's work. This makes Lefebvre sound like he's enamored by city life, like Jane Jacobs or Carrie Bradshaw. In reality, Lefebvre was arguing that capitalist regimes create spaces where the public reproduces and preserves capitalism. Lefebvre did not like capitalism, and even though Abbott later discusses Lefebvre's concept of the right to the city, he doesn't seem to understand that Lefebvre didn't believe people have control over their cities under capitalism. I do want to be fair in my critique of this book, so let's move beyond Lefebvre. Abbott mentions power and economy throughout the book, but they always come in as contradictory to his own beliefs. For example, in the beginning of the book, as I quoted, he says that developers have a subservient role to planners. Later he says this: "Planning is implemented by people with economic or political power, and it has tended to serve the interests of those with an economic stake in urban real estate. Downtown investors, suburban builders and homeowners, and those with the privileged social positions that come with being white, male, well-educated, or well-off." He does say that we should build community gardens on vacant lots, so he gets 1 point there. And he also doesn't overinflate zoning's role in the housing crisis, so 2 points total. Abbott's work is representative of contemporary mainstream planning theory. There's this conflict between the idea that an urban planner has the power to change the world and also that they have no power at all. It's certainly closer to the latter. Planners have a role, but they don't really make things happen. In fact, it might be easier to think of urban planners and urban planning as two separate entities. What does it mean if an urban planner works for 18 months on a plan and the city council rewrites their recommendations? Or worse, shelves the plan forever? Ultimately, the planner does not decide how urban planning progresses. People with power do. We just looked at 4 examples of what the mainstream defines as urban planning. All of these definitions are actually theories of what planning ought to be. They describe planning in an ideal state. They all ignore the actual limits of urban planning. Again, those limits are what planning actually is. In doing so, mainstream planning theory depoliticizes urban planning. It turns it into a simple tool that can do anything the user desires. This isn't true. If it were, then we probably wouldn't have so many urban problems. And worst of all, this is misdirection. In depoliticizing urban planning, these ought theories steer us away from the idea that maybe mainstream planning itself is the problem. Now that you know what the mainstream thinks planning ought to be, let's dive into a theory of what planning actually is. Part 4. What is planning? Scott and Ruiz had a Marxist lens, just like me. They used this lens to arrive to their conclusions. Take that how you want it. But they were attempting, successfully I think, to arrive at an accurate conclusion. So let's walk through it. Regardless of type of economy, capitalist, feudalist, socialist, whichever, human settlements throughout history have been sites of production. Maybe they were agricultural centers, maybe they were trade hubs, maybe they were factory towns. It's important to know that in almost all cases, cities aren't built for the sake of building a city, they're built for the sake of production. Scott and Ruiz argue that production requires a relationship between society and property. This relationship is durable and persistent, meaning we don't wake up every day and change the relationship. Changing this relationship is a revolutionary event. Let's look at our own society-property relationship. Under capitalism, production is the result of wage labor and private property. Ultimately, this is a relationship between wages and profits. Wages and profits are in constant conflict with each other. Wages represent the concrete interests of society, or, in the case of capitalism, workers. Profits represent the concrete interests of property, in the case of capitalism, the owners of production, or the capitalists. Imagine the net income generated by capitalist production. Then imagine dividing that income between wages and profits. Workers will always seek higher wages, and capitalists will always seek higher profits. This balance, as Scott and Ruiz point out, is the central class conflict in capitalist society. If you think that capitalism and our society can be separated, you're mistaken. We have to participate in the economy to survive. Some people think that capitalist markets have a natural balance, but history says otherwise. A mix of the profit motive and uncontrolled independent actions create a system that Scott and Ruiz describe as ever ready to implode upon itself and is indeed innately self-destructive. We can call the things that draw capitalist investment the initial optimum conditions. Through competition and independent actions, these initial optimum conditions degrade over time. Let's look at some examples. Say a logging company is drawn to a virgin forest and starts an operation there. Eventually, more loggers come to the same forest. Not willing to allow the other loggers in the area to outpace them, each logging company competes to maximize their profits. They over-extract from the forest until it's fully logged and no longer profitable for anyone. Or say a developer found the ideal location to build a suburban neighborhood, somewhere close to the city with very little traffic and surrounded by beautiful fields. Well, after they build their subdivision, commercial services and other subdivisions develop around it. The positive qualities of the site are destroyed. Now there's just as much traffic here as anywhere else, and the fields are totally developed. A third example would be commercial landlords in an up-and-coming neighborhood. They all increase their rents to profit off the popularity of the location. Eventually, the rents are too high for the businesses that made the neighborhood so attractive in the first place. They all go out of business or relocate, leaving these storefronts abandoned. Scott and Ruiz say that the modern concept of the state emerged to prevent capitalist collapse. When I say state, I don't mean like Pennsylvania or California, I mean the government in any form. The emergence of the regulatory state effectively ended a long period of laissez-faire capitalism, which is an extremely unregulated form. From the late 1800s until the 1970s, the state increased its regulatory grip on capitalist land development. It did this through professionalized urban planning. In any mainstream planning text, you'll find a long history of urban planning, but this is misleading. The profession of urban planning isn't even 150 years old. By bringing in examples from antiquity, the Middle Ages, and early capitalism, mainstream theory makes urban planning seem like a universal human tool removed from society and economy. But the urban planning that's causing our problems is this professionalized version. Its emergence within the regulatory state has to be taken into account when we define it. So let's recall some facts. Under capitalism, land development is, in almost all cases, initiated by multiple private actors, not by the state. These actors make decisions independently of each other. These actors are also competing against each other to maximize profits. This competition will inevitably erode the initial optimum conditions of each development site. Even though these capitalist firms have significant control over their own land, none of them have control over the urbanization process as a whole. Because they're in competition, they cannot act collectively. Since capitalists initiate the urbanization process, urban planning is inherently a reaction to development pressure. A very small percentage of plans are for brand new towns and cities, and an even smaller fraction of those plans are made prior to development interest. Capitalists always act first, and the state, through urban planning, intervenes when those initial optimum conditions start degrading. Scott and Rowies point out that this reaction, because it's made after the fact, will lead to new problems that weren't there before. Here are some examples. If people from the suburbs drive to the central business district to work, then a state may demolish buildings in the CBD and build parking lots. This would reduce the land available for development, which then limits the growth of the CBD, a new problem. If homelessness is rising, then the state may try to alleviate it by building homeless shelters. But then there will be public opposition to the placement of these shelters, a new problem. If transit services are inadequate, the state may incentivize rideshare services, but this will further decrease transit ridership and therefore transit funding, a new problem. These problems, commuting, homelessness, and a lack of public services, are caused by the shortcomings of capitalism. These are structural issues that require non-capitalist solutions to solve. But the state can't act against capitalism, the state has to preserve capitalism. As Scott and Rowies write, since the capitalist state does not have and can never have a mandate to change fundamental capitalist social and property relations, it can only ever modify the parameters but not the intrinsic logic of the whole urban land development process. In the same way, the capitalist state can never finally resolve that central contradiction of commodity-producing society, namely, the contradiction between the imperatives of private versus collective action. So with all that in mind, I think we're ready for the big reveal. I think it's time to show you Scott and Rowies' definition of what urban planning is. It is now possible to assert that the specific interventionist sphere of urban planning, itself only a specialized domain of state intervention, emerges, like all state intervention, out of a web of concrete, historically determinate conflicts and problems embedded in the social and property relations of capitalist society generally, and out of capitalist urbanization in particular. Isn't it beautiful? Isn't it so comprehensible? It's not Shakespeare, it's not J.D. Salinger, but it's much more accurate than Reddit's definition or the APA's definition. Let's break it out into some bullets. All societies require production in some form. Production requires a durable relationship between society and property. The inherent conflicts and problems of any production relationship cannot be solved without renegotiating the relationship. Under capitalism, a regulatory state emerged to mediate these conflicts and problems. As a mediator, the capitalist regulatory state cannot itself renegotiate the relationship between society and property. Urban planning is a specialized arm of the capitalist regulatory state that deals with urbanization. As a specialized arm of the capitalist regulatory state, urban planning cannot itself renegotiate the relationship between society and property. In less precise terms, urban planning can't solve the problems inherent to capitalism. More importantly, urban planning under capitalism will always attempt to advance capitalism to a more stable form. Even if there are working class benefits that come out of the urban planning process, ultimately, its mission is to preserve the relationship between society and property. We can sit here and imagine a world where good urban planning means we all live in beautiful, affordable, and exciting cities. Places without class and race conflicts, places where we have an abundance of free time and income and hangout spots. But when you say that out loud, you're not describing capitalism, especially not American capitalism. Affordable rents, minimized interpersonal conflicts, free time, and good wages are not inherent components of capitalism. Sure, these things could happen through a regulatory state, but they're not happening. We just walked through a theory of what planning is. Yes, I did use a Marxist lens to get there, but we didn't arrive at a communist theory of planning. That would fall under a theory of what planning ought to be. Sure, people can disagree that capitalism favors capitalists, I guess, but you can't deny that urban planning is bound by the limits of our government and therefore our economy. Urban planning is a tool of the state specifically regarding our economy. So knowing this, it's kind of futile to think that urban planning, as a tool of the state, will provide us social benefits directly. Yes, good things can still happen through urban planning, but only after it's satisfied the society-property relationship. If urban planning has to remain within the boundaries of our society-property relationship, then knowing those boundaries can illuminate the future. We are headed somewhere as a society. There are particular outcomes and consequences of urban planning under this society-property relationship. I can't tell you exactly what the future will look like. I'm not a fortune teller. But by knowing what planning is, we can see something shaping. We can see the patterns. When you have these boundaries, there's only so many possible futures. Let's return to video games so I can show you what I mean. Part 5, Magnasanti. For several decades, the dominant theory of what urban planning ought to be was called rational comprehensive theory. I made a video about it you can check out after this one, but I'll recap. It's a data-intensive approach to planning. It attempts to model the movement of people and goods through an urban area. It's interested more in the process of planning than in the outcomes, and it's quick to dismiss irregularities as failures of the planner rather than failures of the process. There's a great distance between the planner and the public in this theory. That made it easy for planners to propose sweeping destructive changes. A rational comprehensive planner's main concerns were traffic congestion, property values, and business growth. Their solutions were the interstate system, urban renewal, and sprawl. Rational comprehensive planning is the basis of the game SimCity. In one of the best urban planning videos ever published to YouTube, Clayton Ashley of Polygon discusses the use of this theory in the game. His 2021 video titled Unboxing the Hidden Politics of SimCity illustrates how urban planning has an end state due to the rigidity of its assumptions and limitations. Will Wright, creator of SimCity, stumbled into rational comprehensive planning through the book Urban Dynamics by J. Wright Forrester. The book is right-wing in nature and seeks to eliminate what it views as wasteful government programs, as Clayton says.
Urban Dynamics was controversial because it concluded that a lot of the social programs meant to improve a city were actually harmful to its long-term prospects. You know, horrible things like financial aid, low-cost housing, and job training. It was classic anti-welfare politics, dressed up for the computer age. It also helped convince Will Wright that he could turn his rough city-building game idea into a city simulator.
Will Wright coded these assumptions into the game as a model, which Clayton refers to as the black box. Because the in-game world is literally built out of these assumptions, Will Wright converted a theory of what planning ought to be into a theory of what planning is. In the world of SimCity, rational comprehensive planning and all of its value-based assumptions are objectively true. Later in the video, Clayton discusses Magnasanti, a project completed by Vincent Okazla in SimCity 3000. By building Magnasanti, Okazla beat the game. You don't really beat a city builder. Usually you get bored and start a new city. But Magnasanti takes SimCity 3000 to its absolute population limit and develops every part of the map to maximum density. The city can't grow at this point, but it's stable. Clayton describes life in Magnasanti.
Citizens spend their entire life in Magnasanti. No one moves in or out. Not that it's a very long life. Thanks to the lack of hospitals and high pollution, its citizens rarely live past the age of 50. There's no traffic because there are no roads. A subway connects every part of Magnasanti, but there's no real reason to leave your neighborhood because every neighborhood looks exactly the same. There are no fire stations or schools. Just a robust police state to keep everyone in check.
Magnasanti is the end state of rational comprehensive planning theory. It's the perfection of this theory's assumptions, values, and goals. Things like health, happiness, and education don't matter. An absence of crime and traffic do. Magnasanti developed within the boundaries set by SimCity's theory of what planning is. That theory, in a vacuum, is destined to create Magnasanti. Our world is not bound by the limits of rational comprehensive theory like SimCity is. We also don't have a perfectly controlled experimental urban vacuum to test out our own theory of what planning is. However, every city created in SimCity 3000 is an imperfect reflection of Magnasanti. They are incomplete and chaotic in comparison, but every city is in some way headed towards Magnasanti. The same can be said of our world, though in reality the perfect city will not look like Magnasanti. I don't really know what the perfect city under neoliberalism would look like, and I don't want to imagine it. But we are headed there. Every place is headed there, even if they'll never fully achieve neoliberal perfection, whatever that means. Let's look at the boundaries of neoliberal urban planning. Part 6, Neoliberal Urban Planning. My sources on the theory of what planning is were all written before the neoliberal shift in the 1970s. Let's fill in the gaps. The neoliberal shift is the closest thing we've seen to a renegotiation of the society-property relationship. The neoliberal state is openly biased towards capital. Its laws and policies have fundamentally altered life under capitalism and probably can't be reversed. The state has whittled itself down to little more than an agent that transfers the public good into private profit. Neoliberal capitalism is a return to unregulated markets. It's marked by the privatization of public services. This means that services once provided and controlled by the state are transferred to private corporations so they can profit off of them. Neoliberalism is competitive. Everything competes with each other, even city governments. And it's violent. The police and the military preserve neoliberalism's legitimacy by protecting private property from the working class. This violence is most frequently targeted towards BIPOC and low-income people. The neoliberal state has defunded urban support programs for decades. Today, most federal and state-level funding programs are highly competitive. This means that for a project to receive funding, the local government will typically have to put up a sizable match, which is a certain amount of their own money to fund a project. Additionally, almost every competitive grant requires potential projects to maximize their benefit for the private market. Cities also compete for tourism, jobs, and development by distinguishing themselves from each other. They do this through branding, tourism offices, economic development authorities, developer giveaways, and tax incentives. These things all have a cost, so to be competitive, cities have to generate more and more tax revenue. City Skylines is starting to look pretty accurate as a model of neoliberal urban planning. While it's tempting to keep talking about that game, this is not uncharted territory. In his 2019 book, Capital City, Sam Stein argues that in a post-industrial economy, cities primarily generate revenue through property taxes. So it's in a city's best interest to prioritize increasing land values. In this sense, cities are trapped into the endless growth capitalism requires. The cost of competing with other cities and regions, the cost of policing, and the costs of essential public services all compete for this revenue. Stein writes, "Essential public services in most municipalities are funded through property taxes. The fate of public education, public libraries, and public transit are therefore directly linked to the value of property and its rate of taxation. Places with high property values are able to maintain palatial public services, while cities with low property values suffer the indignities of crumbling buildings and broken services. Cities are incentivized to drive out anything that is understood to reduce property values. Types of buildings, businesses, land uses, or even people. Under these conditions, planners managing the property contradiction are being asked to intervene in only one way, to do everything in their power to make land more expensive, and to do nothing that would challenge its status as a commodity rather than a commons. Some planners may intend for these interventions to genuinely improve the lives of lower-income residents, like in building parks or libraries in low-income neighborhoods, for example. However, the private market will seize upon these improvements to further increase property values and their own profits. The result is rising rents and home values, which lead to more vulnerable residents being priced out, evicted, made homeless, or bought out, Stein argues. In the real estate state, planners can create marvelous environments for rich people, but if they work to improve poor people's spaces, they risk sparking gentrification and displacement. Rich communities can lobby for all sorts of planning improvements, but many poor neighborhoods fight planning interventions they would otherwise embrace out of a very real fear that any enhancement will trigger displacement. This is crucial to understand. Way earlier in this essay, I said that it's my own personal value that we should build more bicycle infrastructure. I truly believe that, and as an alternative transportation planner, I work every day to try to make that happen. But low-income people are right to be cautious or even resist these sorts of investments. Whether a planner wants this or not, developers see state investments as free money. And these investments can initiate or accelerate the gentrification process. That's not to say bicycle infrastructure causes gentrification, but it is to say developers are sort of waiting around for the state to give them a handout. Stein sums it up as this. The promise of planning, of creating more beautiful cities, of imposing order on capital's chaos, of undoing the exploitative relations between people and land and between city and country, is virtually impossible to realize under these conditions. Instead, the forces of property present two options for cities, gentrification or disinvestment. Other modalities surely exist, but they are made to feel increasingly unlikely under real estate's rule, which pushes cities towards this binary. Urban planners' main task is ensuring that the former, rather than the latter, represents their city's lot. The neoliberal state cannot eliminate neoliberalism because the state is neoliberalism. And if planning is an arm or a tool of the state, then planning is also unable to solve the problems inherent to neoliberalism. Think back to Magnasanti for a moment. Magnasanti showed the game SimCity 3000 in its most perfected form. No, not every player will be able to replicate Magnasanti by choice or even by accident. But in every game, the player's city is an imperfect reflection of Magnasanti. It's in some way headed towards that end, even if the player will never fully get there. The player will likely start out with big ideas and aspirations, but over time they'll abandon those grand visions and start playing the game by its own rules, the game's theory of what planning is. When we adopt technocratic tweaks like YIMBYism and strong towns, they may have an impact on the form of our cities. But what lies underneath, the social conditions of the city, are always going to head towards the neoliberal ideal. Neoliberal capitalism will capture any potential for societal benefit and convert it into a capital benefit. That's the inherent nature of neoliberalism. Urban planning can't change this nature because it's also the nature of urban planning at present. Part 7. Building an alternative. I'm going to depress you just a little bit more, and then we'll talk about restoring our optimism. Ståle Holgersen's 2020 paper on spatial planning and Marxism, looking back, going forward, is a great roadmap for this. Holgersen uses Andrew Sayre's concept of the diabolic double crisis to illustrate the problems of urban planning. The diabolic double crisis is as bad as it sounds. It's the idea that the economy and the environment are in opposition. Improvements to the economy come at the cost of environmental quality, and improvements to the environment come at the cost of economic growth. As we discussed earlier, the capitalist state creates new problems for every problem it solves. The shift to neoliberalism exacerbates this due to its hands-off and deregulatory nature. Using the 2008 housing crash as an example, Holgersen underscores the fact that a neoliberal state cannot solve the conflicts and problems of neoliberalism, writing, "The underlying problems that caused the crisis have been postponed rather than solved. Real estate markets and processes of urbanization continue, therefore, to be destabilizing factors in the economy. As the political economy is neither providing growth, material foundation, nor hope, ideology, neoliberalism as a way of organizing the political economy is crumbling. This has created a crisis in neoliberal ideology and policy, and it is a crisis in the current planning regime." This planning regime Holgersen is referring to is the current mainstream planning theory, communicative planning, which is the worst thing in the world. Holgersen discusses urban planning's radical left turn in the 70s, which paralleled that of critical geography. But critical geography has remained a major branch in its own field. Radical planning has not. The mainstream wholly rejects the ideas of radical planners and keeps them out of the conversation. Holgersen points out that while there were global protests against the austerity policies that eventually coalesced into neoliberalism, the planning profession didn't join them. The profession, whose existence requires the state, quickly adapted to its theory of what planning ought to be under neoliberalism. This form of planning is called communicative planning. It's based on dialogues between stakeholders. The theory holds that if everybody has a seat at the table, then planning decisions and outcomes will be equitable. But bringing a developer to the same table as the residents they're displacing doesn't change the power structure. It doesn't make the developer rethink their plans. It's just a box check. It's a placating act that legitimizes neoliberalism. Communicative planning theory has been critiqued from all sides, but its ability to satisfy those in power and the lack of a real alternative has led to decades of communicative planning dominance. Still, Holgersen doesn't believe that a revival of 70s and 80s radical planning alone will be sufficient to unseat communicative planning. Much of his essay is focused on the shortcomings of early radical planning. He's especially concerned with the is-ought gap, and hopefully you aren't shocked here. He believes having an ought theory of our own is good. Yes, despite my persistence here, a theory of what planning is not enough to change the world. We have to develop our own theory of what planning ought to be. But there is a key difference. Communicative planning theory is a delusion. It holds that by incorporating open dialogue opportunities, we can solve inequality. That isn't true. So instead of having our ought theory be a delusion, we need to make it a radical aspiration. And we do this by grounding it in our theory of what planning is. As Holgersen puts it, our task is to criticize and reveal power relations while also looking for alternatives. I know that urban planning is sort of my deal, but I think I'm right to say that it's one of the most significant tools of neoliberal capitalism. In our struggle to create a more just world, urban planning will be a formidable opponent, not a neutral player. And this leads to a contradiction that Holgersen points out. Planning practices that build upon Marxism are surely impossible without changes outside of the sphere of planning, but also vice versa. Major social, political, and economic transformations that will prevent climate change and challenge the logic of capitalism are also impossible without reorganizing landscapes and producing new spaces. In other words, Urban planning is both the tool of our total destruction and the tool that will save us all. It's hard to imagine how to transform it into something good, but we can try. Here's Holgersen again. People working within planning, planners, politicians, theoreticians, activists, etc., must necessarily interact and collaborate with people outside of planning. For example, political parties, labor unions, activist groups of various kinds, neighborhood organizations, community gardening, or grassroots organizations struggling for urban commons. But the diabolic crisis forces us to articulate critique in an offensive sense. After all, the main aim of Marxism is not to fight the power, but to produce a new hegemony, to implement new ways of producing and organizing space. In this respect, we need to discuss geographical scale and our relation to seizing power. It's on us to create this program. It doesn't exist right now. There are a lot of ideas out there, especially at the local level, but there isn't a mass movement that addresses the need to change urban planning. I know y'all hate to hear that. Like when I talked about Right to the City, a lot of people, well-meaning people, left comments asking me how to win it. Well, we have to fight for it. First, we have to educate ourselves so that we can see the world as it actually is. Then, we have to find each other out there in the real world. We have to organize some sort of movement. Then, and this is difficult, we have to make strong demands to the state and hold the line until we get them. That's revolutionary. Obviously, I believe that we're in the educational stage. I don't think that most people know what these demands should be, and I don't mean to dismiss anyone, and I don't mean to elevate myself, but neoliberalism is very good at infiltrating the minds of the people who live under it. It's like this comfort that we always want to return to. But we have to reject it if we're going to move forward, and you do that by educating yourself. I hope my videos play some role in that, but it can't all come from me. I'm not saying that we need to stop working on smaller changes. I'm not saying that we need to have an urban planning revolution before we try to make the world a better place. But what I am saying is that whatever fight you're in right now, you're going to be in that fight until our society-property relationship changes. If you're fighting displacement, pedestrian deaths, a lack of equitable transit, you're going to be in that fight for a while. To help you maintain the path, whether you're new to this or a veteran, Holgersen asks the 5 questions: what, for whom, by whom, how, and where. The answers to these questions can help you determine if something will advance neoliberalism or if it requires more revolutionary action. But you will have to be honest when answering. For example, say planners are approving a luxury apartment tower in a low-income neighborhood. Let's answer the 5 questions. What is being planned? A luxury apartment tower. For whom is it being planned? For people who can afford high rents. By whom was it planned? A mix of the developer and the planning department. How has it been planned? Through communicative planning. And where is it being placed? In a low-income neighborhood where land is cheap. So, of course, you can do some YIMBY mental gymnastics and argue something like, oh, well, it'll lower rents in all of the city and all of the land and everyone will pay nickels and pennies each month. But that's just a desired secondary effect. That's not a guaranteed effect. That's just thinking of what ought to happen. The act of planning here is 100% for the benefit of private interests. So keep that in mind when you're trying to answer the 5 questions. Don't create an is-ought gap for something that is actually happening. You only want to create that gap for something that isn't happening, an aspirational condition. Here's how we'd answer the 5 questions if we didn't live under neoliberal capitalism. What has been planned? Something useful. For whom has it been planned? For the community. By whom has it been planned? By the community. How has it been planned? Democratically and with high participation. Where are things being placed? Wherever they provide the most benefit and least harm to society and the environment. Now, before you say anything, this is a long-term goal. I don't expect this to happen tomorrow. I have no idea when it'll happen, but I'm optimistic. And what I believe more than anything is that this is a powerful idea. It's on each of us to learn how to make this happen and to take action. Hey, so everything that we just watched, I recorded in October before the election, and I spent a lot of time editing thinking that it would still be relevant, like the ending would make sense, and we could just move along, but ultimately I've decided that I need to recontextualize what I said in a post-election society. So let's do a little postmortem. I've been reading Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, written in 1651, and it's left me with a lot of thoughts. So if you ever hear people talk about Leviathan or Thomas Hobbes, they usually describe him as a monarchist, but if you read Leviathan, he actually talks about monarchy, aristocracy, and representative democracy as three ideal forms of government. Leviathan is not just about monarchy, it's about governments like our own, and it was a foundational text in the creation of America. Thomas Hobbes is often played against John Locke. They are both, I guess, the fathers of liberalism, but they have very differing ideas. I actually like reading John Locke, and if we had his version of liberalism, I don't know if things would be so horrible. But where I think they differ in the most important way, especially right now, is that John Locke believed that if the government stopped serving the people should overthrow it. Thomas Hobbes believed that once the government was created, it had to be preserved forever, and that people are not able to critique it, or protest it, or revolt against it. This thought way seems to be very common today in liberal America. I think that, I don't want to say that every liberal is like that, but kinda every liberal is like that, where there's this drive to preserve this system we have, and that the system itself is perfect, it's just the ways that it's used are failing, and that if we can strip away these things that are causing it to perform poorly, then it will return to its ideal self. I see this in the urbanist movement. Most urbanists reject non-market solutions or diminish them. Urbanists think that through deregulation, we will return to the original society-property relationship that, in their minds, used to function correctly. Like, when you think about urbanist posts, they always show pictures of old cities and they're like, we used to be a country and stuff like that. Like, there is definitely a return with a V aspiration of urbanists that I think is completely ahistorical. And that's why I made this video. I think that the urbanism movement has depoliticized planning in a very dangerous way. Urbanists are concerned with the aesthetics of a city, not so much the social conditions of a city. When we talk about urban planning purely in aesthetics, it makes it seem like a tool. When we think of it as a tool, we hide the ideological elements of urban planning, and people start to say things like, oh, well, this is no nonsense, this is bipartisan, this is a neutral recommendation, and they're really stepping fully into neoliberal ideologies. Using neoliberal tools will always result in neoliberal outcomes, and neoliberalism has proven that it is not concerned with equity. It's not concerned with providing benefit for people, it's only concerned with profit. Regulations are intended to steer the system towards a more equitable end, and as we strip away these regulations, we get more inequitable outcomes. Deregulating capitalism will never solve the problems of capitalism. People seem to understand this with healthcare, for example. Obviously, if we give more power to insurance companies, it's not going to lead to better healthcare or more affordable healthcare for people. We would have to get rid of insurance companies entirely if we wanted an equitable healthcare system. But a lot of self-identifying progressives and leftists seem to ignore this logic when it comes to urban planning. They seem to think that more capitalism will lead to better outcomes, particularly with land development. This is what depoliticizing planning does. That's why I created this channel. I'm here to try and help people get the knowledge they need to see urban planning from a leftist standpoint. At this point, I get way more positive comments on my videos than negative ones, and I really appreciate you guys for doing that, but I am a human being, so I kind of dwell on those negative ones sometimes. And the trend seems to be that people who don't like my content often think that I have made this stuff up. So it is true that, I'm selecting things specifically to relay to you. But this is actually not a place where I do a lot of my own theory. This is an education channel. I'm almost always relaying to you someone else's ideas. And I do that because these ideas are extremely common in academia, but they're kind of hard to access if you're on the outside of it. And if you don't really know anything about it, it's almost impossible to begin a search and figure out what to read. In contrast, urbanism is everywhere. That point of view is known. It's published all over the place. There are hundreds of urbanist channels, and they all kind of say the same thing. They're very united in their rhetoric. And they're not really offering you any other point of view. They're not really helping you see another side of things. They're just regurgitating this mainstream neoliberal concept of urban planning. I'm working here. I'm trying to bring those ideas to you as conveniently as possible, right? Like, I know that a lot of people don't have time to read, and a lot of people don't know how to find academic articles without a login, and a lot of people aren't in practice of reading academic articles, which can be difficult the first time you do it. I do believe that everybody can eventually get the gist. I don't know. I try to be entertaining, and I try to give it to you straight. Like, I don't want to baby you, and I don't want to give you these ideas that are just rhetoric. You know, I really want to give you a foundation, and I hope that it eventually encourages you to find more of the stuff on your own, or find other creators or writers or people, more importantly, people in the real world doing this work. I hope that this channel can drive you towards that kind of stuff. So to summarize the video that you just watched, I want people to know that urban planning is ideological, that urban planning is not some sort of leftist bastion, that urban planning has a politic underneath of it that is often obscured, and those politics are not aligned with an anti-capitalist movement. I put a lot into this video. It took me over 6 months to make, and I was working pretty much the whole time. But, you know, let's not beat around the bush. I don't release videos very quickly, and I wish I could. I wish I could pump them out every month. That would be amazing. Not just for myself, but like I really want these ideas out there, and there's so many things I want to talk about. But I work a full-time job. It's a very demanding job. I have very little energy, and I do this when I can. That being said, I did start a Patreon, and I would love it if you consider becoming a patron. This will be a place for my in-between ideas, like book reviews, research updates, and little critiques. I've already posted a 43-minute, for some reason, book review of Carlos Moreno's The 15-Minute City, A Solution to Saving Our Time and Our Planet. If you like what I do and you're interested in hearing more and more frequently, then for just $3 a month, you can become a patron and really support me in growing this channel. I'll be releasing videos like this once a month and thinking up other things I can do for my patrons, and I'm very excited to create a community there. Anyway, I know in this post-election world there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of difficulty in imagining a better future, but I really do believe in us. I really do think we can get there, and of course, I think the most important thing to do first is to educate yourself on anti-capitalist principles. Thank you so much for your time today, and I'll see you in the next one.